and then you have a day of judgment. Okay, where the God, our master, will come down and he will create a paradise for everyone. Okay, so what matters is to live a noble life and await the day of judgment where eventually heaven on earth will manifest. Okay? And this is important because if you think about how the Iranians are fighting this war, the Iranians refuse to take the initiative and destroy too much, okay? They refuse to be the villains in this war because for them, in their eschatology, it's important to die for the light, to fight for the truth, okay? Now, Zoroastrianism has a major impact on Jewish eschatology, okay? And Jewish eschatology, again, I'm only talking about the most extreme version of this eschatology, okay? And in this eschatology, the idea is that the Jews disobeyed God, okay? Disobedience. And in order to repair the world, to save themselves, to create heaven on earth, they need to engage in redemption, okay? Redemption. And redemption is really about spiritual alchemy, improving yourself as a person, being good to yourself, being good to others, loving your neighbor as though you would love yourself. Okay, that's a mainstream idea. But in the most extreme version, redemption just means acting out God's plan to compel the return of the Messiah. Okay, and this plan is basically create Israel. Return Jewish diaspora, build third temple, and this will often call the War of Gog and Magog. And then when the Jews are most threatened, the Messiah will come to save them from their enemies. And this will create something called the Messianic age, okay? When God rules over the earth through his Messiah, who comes from the house of David. Okay, all right. So again, this is a simple version. There are lots of different versions. This is the most simple version for our purposes, okay? Now, what's interesting is that this Jewish eschatology would go on to influence the Protestants, okay? And this creates a movement called Christian Zionism. Christian Zionism, so the technical word for Christian Zionism is called premillennial dispensationalism. Okay, and this sounds very complicated, but it's not. All it means is that God has a plan for how to create heaven on earth, and we have a duty to fulfill his plan by following his instructions. Okay? All right. So what Christian Zionism is doing is that it takes this Jewish eschatology and makes certain changes to it. Okay? So, for example, the first change that it makes is, okay, this plan is fine, but rather than say that the Jewish Messiah is the representative of God, what they say is that, no, he's actually the representative of Satan. Okay? So the Messiah, in the Jewish tradition, becomes the Antichrist in the Christian Zionist tradition. And why is this important? It's important because for the Christians, the Messiah must be Jesus. Okay? So the Messiah, so the Antichrist, what he does is that he rules over the world. He's very charismatic, and he rules the world in Jerusalem. And he starts the War of Gog and Magog in order to conquer the world and destroy the Jews. At this point, Jesus will return to save God's chosen people, the Jews. And when Jesus returns, there'll be something called the Rapture, where all Christians will immediately ascend to heaven. Okay? So the Rapture. All right. Okay? So again, Christian Zionism is working off Jewish eschatology, but it's making some important changes, okay? So another way of saying this is, in the beginning, Zionists and Christian Zionists will work together to reach a certain point of history, okay, what we call the Great Israel Project, but then they will diverge and fight against each other, okay? So they're allies now, but eventually they'll turn against each other. All right, so now I want to talk about the Freemasons. Because the Freemasons, we'll talk more about the Freemasons later, okay? The Freemasons are also working within the Christian Zionist context, but they are much more focused on actually how to implement this, okay? So what they want to do is they want to take the Antichrist and turn it into a system. And this system we discussed last semester, it's called Pax Judaica. What is Pax Judaica? Pax Judaica is that Israel controls the world through AI, okay, an AI surveillance state. Okay? Or their exact words is Holy Empire. Okay? And Pax Judaica, the AI surveillance state, will have things such as the mark of the beast. And what is the mark of the beast? It is digital ID. Okay, and this digital ID will also lead to digital currency. And they can actually put a microchip or a QR bar in your forehead, and this will be considered the mark of the beast, okay? And this is all part of the Christian Zionist eschatology. Another really important thing about the Freemasons is the idea of a one world government. Because remember, the Antichrist is the leader of a one world government, and it'll be based in Jerusalem, okay? And so the headquarters will be Solomon's Temple, or the Third Temple. All right, okay. So these are the, and then you have the Islamic eschatology, okay? In the Islamic eschatology is a response to all these other eschatologies, where they say that when the system is created, it'll be called Dajjal, the Antichrist, okay? And when this happens, then Jesus will return to defeat the Antichrist. Okay, that's the mainstream Islamic eschatology. Then you have the Shia. Okay, the Shia are the Iranians, where they believe that it will be the 12th Imam Mahdi who will lead the followers, okay, the Ummah. Okay, Ummah just means community of believers, into victory against the Antichrist, the Dajjal, okay? So you can see how these eschatologies are basically lining up together, right? The Shia are the Iranians. The Islamic is the entire Arab world, right? Now, there are two more eschatologies I want to look at. And again, I know this is a lot. I know this is too much information, and we'll go over these eschatologies specifically as we move along, okay? But I just want to introduce the different eschatologies. Another eschatology that's very important is the Catholic eschatology. And in the Catholic eschatology, we can call City of God, okay, which is the church, which is Jerusalem. And St. Augustine talks about this, about how the Catholic Church, it is the millennium, it is the Messianic age, because we represent God and we bring peace and prosperity to the world. Now, what's important about the church is that it became the dominant power in the world because Rome fell, okay? So Roman Empire collapses. But this is all part of God's divine plan, because Roman Empire, Rome, was the city of earth, okay, of power, of money, of wealth. And what matters is Jerusalem, the city of God, of spirituality, of divinity, okay? Now, the city of God came to an end because of the rise of the Protestants and the Anglo-American Empire. So for the Catholic Church to achieve its eschatology and establish again the city of God, what they need to do is also see the Anglo-American Empire destroyed, just like the Roman Empire. Okay? So that is the Catholic eschatology. The last eschatology I want to discuss is the Orthodox eschatology. And what's the Orthodox eschatology? The Russians. Okay? And this is called the Third Rome prophecy. Okay? The Third Rome prophecy is basically that Moscow will become the third Rome. Okay, the first Rome was Rome, second Rome was Constantinople, the third Rome will be Moscow. And also what's really important to appreciate is that there will be no fourth Rome. So when Moscow becomes the third Rome, history ends. Okay, and peace and prosperity will come to the world. Okay, so what does this mean? It means that Russia will unite the Orthodox world. Okay, so right now the Orthodox world is split into Eastern Orthodoxy and Greek Orthodoxy. Okay, and something that is very important that this prophecy says is that the Russians will defeat Turkey in a war, and then have the Greeks return to Constantinople, which is modern day Istanbul. Okay, that's what the prophecy says. And so you look at all these different eschatologies, okay? And again, guys, this is the majority of the world, right? If you actually look at the convergence points, you come to some startling conclusions, okay? So let's look at the convergence. All right, where do they converge? Okay, well, first of all, okay, where they converge is that the greater Israel project will be achieved, okay? Pax Judaica will be achieved. It's the one world government, okay? One world government. That is one major convergence. If that's true, then another convergence is the Al-Aqsa Mosque will give way to the third temple. All these eschatologies either say this or are indifferent to saying this, okay? They're not opposed to this, all right? So that's why I predict the Al-Aqsa Mosque will be destroyed because they need to build a third temple. Another thing in which they converge is the rise of anti-Semitism. Why? Because that will force the diaspora, the Jewish diaspora, to return to Israel. This is very important for this eschatology, okay? All right. Another important convergence point is the war of Gog and Magog. We don't actually know what this is, but this war is supposed to be the final war before the return of God, before the end of history, before the end of the world, okay? What this war is, we don't know yet. But another thing is that this war in Iran will lead to the war of Gog and Magog at some point, okay? What this war is, we'll discuss at a later time. Another thing that's very important is US and China are not part of this eschatology, okay? This is where everyone agrees. For whatever reason, the United States is not going to partake in future events. Neither will China, which means that something will happen to these two countries that will make them not significant anymore, okay? And the best prediction for the United States then is civil war, right? Okay, civil war. Okay, and this is where all these eschatologies converge. So in other words, this war in Iran is happening so that these different eschatological traditions can achieve heaven on earth from their perspective. All right. So what this means, so given this convergence, we can actually predict certain events that will happen over the next 2 to 4 years. Okay? Because they all want these things to happen together. All right. So let's look at some quick predictions. Okay. First prediction, of course, is that the US will use ground troops. Because using ground troops will create a national draft. And what does a national draft do? It creates a civil war, right? A lot of young people are going to refuse to fight in this war. And this is going to create protests. Then America will have no choice but to deploy the National Guard. And this will create the recipe for a lot of civil conflict in America. Okay? Another thing that will happen is because you use ground troops, you will lose the war, and then CENTCOM, which is the American military in the Middle East, will then transfer over to Israel. Okay? What's happening in this war is that the economies of the GCC are being destroyed, and that's part of the plan. Okay? Because for Israel to achieve the Greater Israel Project, it needs to absorb the GCC and parts of Turkey and parts of Egypt, okay? So another way of saying this is that the GCC is basically finished. The intention is to collapse their economies and make them irrelevant, right? The third thing we can expect is that Turkey will enter this war, and Saudi Arabia actually, will enter the war. Because you want to use this war to weaken opposition to these eschatologies as much as possible. Okay? So Turkey and Saudi Arabia will enter this war, and they will suffer tremendously because of their participation. All right. Again, the Al-Aqsa Mosque will be destroyed. Okay? And then you have the rise of Persia. The rise of Persia. Why is this important? Because you need the Islamic world to unite against Israel for the end of days, right? So you don't mind if actually Iran wins this war, because by winning this war, Iran will activate its Persian identity. And this is important for eschatology because in the war of Gog and Magog, people are interpreting Gog and Magog, which will march against Israel. They're interpreting Gog and Magog to be Persia and Russia. Okay? Okay? Together they will march against Pax Judaica. Number 6 is that in Israel, you will achieve the Pax Judaica and the Greater Israel Project. Okay? So the Greater Israel Project and Pax Judaica are not the same thing, guys. Greater Israel is just basically the territory that the Israelis believed that God had promised their ancestor Abraham. Pax Judaica is a one world government, okay, based on AI surveillance and the mark of the beast. So what will happen is that Israel will use this war to expand its territory, and then what will happen is that capital, technology, will then start to flow to Israel in order to create the Pax Judaica. So think of companies like NVIDIA, Oracle, Microsoft, Google. Well, they'll probably transfer themselves to Israel because that is where the power will rest. Okay? So Pax Judaica. Then you will have Russia winning the war in Ukraine, okay? And then return Greeks to Constantinople. Basically, another way of saying this is, it is possible that the Greeks go to war against Turkey, and then Russia supports the Greeks and return the Greeks to Istanbul, okay? But then you're like, wait a minute, Turkey is a NATO member. Well, we can also expect destruction of Europe, okay? The end of NATO, basically. So, this war in Ukraine it's not just about Russia protecting its borders. This war in Ukraine is also meant to achieve Orthodox eschatology, to destroy Europe, to destroy NATO, so that Russia can achieve the third Rome prophecy. That means the destruction of Europe. So I will discuss the Russian-Ukraine war later on as we go along, okay? But what I'm trying to show you is that just by, okay, analyzing the most extreme eschatologies of different religious traditions, you can then, from this analysis, pick out points in which they agree. Okay? And at these points, you can figure out then how they will affect current geopolitics, to make certain predictions about how the war will progress, about how the world will transform itself in the next 2 to 4 years. Okay? So this is called the law of eschatological convergence. It gives us tremendous insight into why things are turning out the way they are. Okay? Because again, I keep on saying this, but purely from a geopolitical perspective, purely from a realpolitik perspective, this war in Iran makes no sense. But if you look at it from an eschatological perspective, then it makes perfect sense. Okay?